In this video, we're going to go over how to build Visual Studio solutions in projects with PowerShell. So one question we might have right out of the gate is why use PowerShell when we have Visual Studio? Visual Studio is awesome. It's really powerful. It has a really rich feature set and makes our lives better. But Visual Studio does have some weaknesses. One of those is that it can be very resource intensive. Depending on the type of machine that you're running, how large your code base is, what extensions you may have, it's going to require a lot of resources from your machine. And because of this, it can often run slow. So going from opening up your solution, having it load, and actually being able to make changes within the editor can sometimes take a few minutes. And additionally, it's not always needed to perform the tasks that we want to accomplish. So in this video, we're talking specifically about doing builds. So we don't always need Visual Studio in order to perform our builds. So some useful scenarios where I find it helpful to use PowerShell to do builds is in a scenario where maybe I've made a bunch of commits locally and everything's working well. But before I can push my commits to GitHub, let's say, I have to pull in whatever other changes people on my team have made, and then I want to do a build to make sure that everything is still working after pulling in those changes, and then ultimately push my changes to the server. Typically, before I pull from GitHub, I'll close Visual Studio, then do the pull, and then I want to build, but I don't really want to have to open up Visual Studio again and go through all that ceremony just to do the build. I'd rather just build from PowerShell, wait for that to finish and be successful, and then do my push to the server. Another scenario that I find this to be really helpful is when I want to keep an API current while I'm working on the client side of a project. So maybe I'm the JavaScript developer on a project and the Visual Studio solution has a project for the single page application that doesn't have any server-side code. And maybe I'm working on that within Visual Studio Code or Sublime, something like that. But another member of my team is working on the API, and there's a web API project in the solution, and that obviously does have server-side code. So I need to be pulling in his changes and doing builds on my local machine to keep my API up to date, but I don't want to have to keep on opening Visual Studio in order to do that. I'd rather just do my build from PowerShell and continue working on the client-side code. Now, Visual Studio's build functionality is mostly centered around the msbuild.exe that gets installed alongside Visual Studio. And so what it does is essentially call out to this executable with various parameters in order to perform the builds that it makes available through its user interface. And what's nice about this is that we can use that same executable, the msbuild.exe, to perform our own builds from PowerShell. So msbuild is a topic unto itself. It has a lot of different parameters that it can take, and it can do a lot of different things. But for our use case here, we're just going to use it to build a solution or build a project. Another thing that we can do is install the NuGet command line interface. And similar to msbuild, it's just an executable on our machine, and we can make calls out to that to perform NuGet package restores. NuGet can also do lots of different things as well, just like msbuild, but for our use case, we'll use it just to do NuGet package restores. So why don't we start by installing the NuGet command line interface. The easiest way to do that is just to download just the raw executable and copy it to somewhere that is in your system file path. So a pretty safe bet for that is just to copy it into C Windows. That will surely be part of your file path. So let me paste it in there. And if we go to PowerShell right now, we should be able to now type in NuGet help, and we see that it knows what NuGet is now and all the different options that are available. So let me clear this out. So now that that's here, let's look at the function that we're going to use to perform our builds. So I'll open it up in Visual Studio Code. So the function's name is build_vs, and it takes in three different parameters. One is the relative path to a solution or project file, so a .sln or a dot, in the case of C#, csproj. Then an optional parameter of if we want to do a NuGet package restore, And lastly, another optional parameter if we want to perform a clean before we do the build. Both of these optional parameters are defaulted to true. What the function actually does is first we set a variable, and it's just set to the path of where the MS build executable is. Then we check if we want to do a NuGet package restore. If we do, we call out to NuGet and tell it to restore, and just giving it the path of our solution file or project file. Next, we're checking if we want to clean. We make a call out to the MS build executable and tell it to do a clean. And lastly, we just call out to the MS build executable and tell it to do a build. And that's really about it. Pretty simple, 3 parameters, but it packs a pretty powerful punch. So how do we actually go about making this function available to us from within PowerShell? To do that, we just have to add this build vs function to our PowerShell profile. Now, if you don't already have a profile, I'll show you how to make one real quick. Open up a PowerShell console and type the command $profile. This will echo back the full file path of where Windows will be looking for the profile. So we see it's in My Documents in a directory called Windows PowerShell with this file name. So let me go ahead and add that directory. New folder. So that's there now. Let's grab the full file path now. Go back to where we had our function, and let's save this file as the full file path of where it's looking for the profile. Save that. If we go back to PowerShell and do a dot space $profile, PowerShell will load this new profile for us. And so we should now have access within PowerShell to call build vs. So let's go to a directory where I have just this dummy solution for us to play with. So we look at the contents of the directory, we see that we have a solution file there. So let's try and build it. So I'll do build vs and give it the relative path to the solution. So first we see that it's restoring the NuGet packages. Then it's cleaning the solution, and it does a bunch of deleting. And then it builds the solution. Now, let's say we wanted it to not do a NuGet package restore. Well, remember those parameters that we can pass to it? We just specify that we don't want it to do the NuGet package restore. So there's a couple different ways you could do this as far as ways to call PowerShell functions. One easy way is just build vs, give it the relative path once more, tell it to not do NuGet, and we still want it to do a clean though. Scroll up to the top, and we see this time there's no NuGet package restore. It's just starting with the clean and then doing the build. If we didn't want it to do a clean or a NuGet package restore, we could just make this false, and this time it just did the build.
So that's about all there is to it to building Visual Studio solutions and projects from PowerShell. Hopefully this video has been helpful and that you found some scenarios where this might come in handy. As always, I'll post links to the corresponding blog post, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them in the YouTube comments or on my blog. Thanks. Have a good one.